you all for coming. This is the dual plenary session on challenges and opportunities for renewables. Thank you for joining us today. I think we've put together an exciting panel. We really wanted to get into some of the real issues going on and hear from market participants who are actually involved in the challenge of trying to integrate large-scale renewables into our current system. We're going to do it in a slightly different order than in the program because it makes more sense this way. So first of all, I am Tom Drennan. I am VP of Conferences for this Tulsa conference, and I am a professor of economics at Hobart and William Smith Colleges in Geneva, New York. So joining us today is Stephen Monroe. And Stephen is going to serve, he's going to give an introductory analysis, and he's going to serve as the discussion moderator for this session. Stephen is Bloomberg New Energy Finance's U.S. policy analyst. He focuses on administrative, legislative, and regulatory developments affecting the finance and deployment of low-carbon energy. All of these bios are online, of course. As you can see, it's a little bit challenging to read them like that, so I'm just going to give a couple key highlights. And then we're going to go to Mario Hurtado, who is the co-founder and executive vice president of development of Clean Line Energy. He has 20 years of experience in power and energy industries to collaborate with the company's management on developing its 4 transmission line projects, and he's going to talk about their role in bringing the actual electrons. Okay, then we're going to move to Jameson Smith, who's the Director of Policy Studies at Mid-Continental ISO. He's been with MISO since 2006. Where he's worked on the development of long-term value-based transmission planning process, utilizing resource expansion and production cost models. And finally, we'll have Scott Vogt finish the panel, and Scott joined ComEd in 1998 as a financial analyst and has served in a variety of positions in finance, including Director of Finance at Exelon Nuclear, where he was responsible for the development of monthly financial forecasts and plant valuations. So I think we have a really good panel. The goal is, again, Stephen will give the introductory structure, and then we'll move to each of the panelists. Each panelist has been asked to speak for about 10 minutes, and then that should leave plenty of time for solid discussion and lots of questions. So with that, I'll step aside and let Stephen take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. So moving slides forward is just a matter of hitting the space bar, right? Let me try this. Okay, well, hi everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. By way of further introduction, I want a couple of disclaimers. I am not an economist, nor am I the original author of any of the slides that I'm going to show you. So hopefully that's enough Teflon to protect me here. What I do enjoy is a chair in Washington, D.C., where I'm BNEF's policy analyst for the Americas. And in that chair, I get to see everything that pretty much comes through to be published about the Americas and about the U.S. in particular. And that gives me the right to cherry pick some of my colleagues' work, which is what I've done to bring here today. So I do want to acknowledge our BNEF sector analysts, especially in wind and solar, who are the sources of what I'll be showing here. Let's start off with a look at what are the levelized cost of energy by generating technology in the U.S. as of the first half of 2016. And specifically, this information was dated April 12th, so it's about 6 months old. What we saw here, and just to give you a little bit of a key here, The hollow diamonds represent the previous snapshot we took, which was in H2 of 2015. The solid fill diamonds represent where we saw pricing midpoints in the first half of 2016. So to summarize, what we saw is that LCOEs came down in all major generating technologies from the second half of last year through the first half of this year. It was most pronounced in nuclear, but I hasten to add that it also had to do with a little bit of updating in the methodology that we use. We applied primarily some new cost of money estimates, as well as higher capacity factors on the plants that are still running, still up and running. So the nuclear one I would suggest is a little bit misleading, but we feel really, really good about the other LCOE comparisons that you see there. And as you can tell, on an overall basis, the lowest cost of generation continues to be the holy trinity of hydro, combined cycle gas, and coal. And these technologies have the added advantage of being on whenever the plants are generating. In other words, they don't suffer from any sort of intermittency penalty, which is something that we're sure to discuss a little bit further here today. Nevertheless, there are gains being registered, as I said, in all technologies, including the clean energy technologies that are what we focus on. And the degree of the cost improvement is actually surprising even to us. We've been covering costs in this sector since 2004, and certainly would have expected to see at least some sort of a slowdown in the improvement down the experience curve, especially in the case of wind, which we really regard as a mature technology. But the fact is that's not the fact. These prices are continuing to fall, and if we can address some of the reasons why that might be true a little bit later. Let's look specifically at the cost of photovoltaic solar by state. Again, this is first half of this year. You can see the range is quite large. Alaska, not surprisingly, features the highest solar costs. Texas, perhaps somewhat surprisingly, shows the lowest. I also want to point out here that the yellow bars represent subsidized price levels. This, in the case of solar, is primarily by virtue of the investment tax credit, which gives solar a significant leg up in all markets because it is a federal tax. The gray dashed bars hovering up there in space represent the true cost, the unsubsidized cost of solar PV on a state-by-state basis. Looking at wind, same formula, just a different color. We use blue to portray wind, and of course the state lineup is somewhat different, at least at the high end, where we see the southeastern states of Alabama, Georgia, and Florida having the highest cost. And in many ways, this is a function of having the poorest resource, the poorest wind resource. But it also has to do with some cost-related factors, and also cost-related factors related to installation experiences. The rates of utility power in the Southeast remain some of the lowest in the country, representing a sizable hurdle for wind development, that in turn impacts the cost of wind. Now, I've been talking up until now about our experience in the first half of this year. I will tell you that this week we will be releasing our second half cost study for the U.S. As a matter of fact, it's due to be released this afternoon. Unfortunately, I'm not able to show you all of the slides from that because they simply weren't available when I had the opportunity to put my presentation together last week. However, I took a look at some very, very high-level numbers and was rather surprised by what I saw. From the first half of 2016 to the second half of 2016, looking at the midpoint of those two state charts I just showed you, in other words, the states that are sort of roughly in the middle, we're going to be reporting this week a 17% reduction in the cost of wind and a 22% reduction in the cost of solar in a calendar year period. To get back to what I said before, we're very surprised about this. We certainly would have expected to see high single digits, and in fact we have seen some high single digit comparisons in the past. What's going on here is basically just it's party time for renewables with regard to costs. And this is due not in any small degree to federal support and state support, which not only has provided a significant cost reduction at the point of purchase for these technologies, but it also, the federal support and state support in a number of places has allowed the experience curve to progress much more rapidly than it perhaps otherwise would have. Talking about experience curves for PV, this is a global curve, and the reason I use a global curve rather than attempting to portray anything for the U.S. is because of the inherently global nature of the solar business. The fact is that solar is driven not by cost considerations here in the States, or for that matter in the Americas, but very much so by cost considerations in Asia, where most of the gear comes from, and in Europe, where most of the gear has been deployed. So as a result, I'm just going to show you a global one here. And you can see that we're going down a pretty steep curve here, and where we sit right now, or at least as of last month in London, where we first showed this slide, we're looking at a module cost, a PV module cost of $4, excuse me, 40 cents, forgive me, a watt. Down from, let's go back to 2012, saying right about at $1 only 4 years ago. Wind, not quite as steep, but again, continuing to make progress on the all-important measure of costs. And on this one, I went ahead and added in those faint purple rules, a little bit of idea of where things stand. Wind is much more of a regional market in terms of its costs than solar, for reasons that I hope I was able to explain before. But in any case, what we're seeing at this point in time with wind is that as far as major markets go, the U.S. is the cost leader in the world. Wind in Texas now is available for, in general, for about $40 a megawatt hour. As many of you in this room are probably aware, in a number of cases, it's been sold in the Texas market for much less. These prices, I might point out, by the way, are not subsidized prices. These do not include the effect of the production tax credit. And at the other end of the spectrum, in major economies, we're looking at Japan, where wind prices continue to, or I should say, are well north of $120 a megawatt hour. And, excuse me, yeah, a megawatt hour. So I'm going to stop right there just so I can let my colleagues here at the DS come up and talk a little bit about what they're working on. And then hopefully a little bit later in the presentation, all of us will get a chance to hear any questions you might have about what we're showing. So Mario, you ready for that?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. It's going to be, I'm going to try to do a quick tour of what Clean Line Energy is doing, and then use as an example the project that I spend most of my time on, which is called the Plains and Eastern Clean Line Project, which actually will connect over around 4,500 megawatts of new wind energy in the Oklahoma Panhandle region with the Mid-South and Southeast. Try to get this right. There we go. So it's kind of interesting. I know that this conference, I mean, right now we're talking about renewables. There's a lot that you're talking about, shale oil and shale gas. And when I was flying in today, I was thinking about that. And I just thought it was kind of ironic. I kind of owe the fact that I'm in renewables at all to the shale gas revolution, because about 9-10 years ago, I was working with a small group. We were working with an investor that was trying to do LNG import terminals into North America. And if those of you that were around then saw, we were one of the 20-something projects in North America, and we had a couple in Europe that we were working on. And I remember going to a talk, CIRA talk in Houston, and Aubrey McClendon got up and talked about how all the gas in the Marcellus Shale was going to make the Qataris regret all of their LNG investments. And sure enough, it didn't make sense to do LNG import terminals, and so I was talking to my friend Michael Skelling, who said he wanted to start a transmission company to really relieve the bottlenecks in the wind energy industry. And so that's kind of how we started the company. about 7 years ago, and we always use the map of the US with the different wind levels from NREL and then the electric transmission system at the high voltages to talk about kind of what it is that we're doing. So, obviously the strongest wind is in the middle of the country. You're talking about a 40% energy difference in terms of how energetic the wind is from sort of the nice, really deep purple areas to where most of the country is sort of those greens and yellows. But there's not a lot of transmission where the purple is because there hasn't traditionally been a lot of people there. And so what we saw was an opportunity to really interconnect regions. The utilities is organized in RTOs. That you might hear a little bit from MISO, but MISO and SPP and ERCOT, those RTOs in the middle of the country, they have all done big projects to build out transmission to work to go basically from west to east within their own regions, and we saw an opportunity to really interconnect regions. So our sort of business plan is built on doing long distance transmission for very energetic wind and getting it to bigger markets, and these are the 5 projects that we're working on across the country. The project that I spend most of my time on is called the Plains and Eastern Clean Line Project. It's about a north of $2 billion investment, and it'll interconnect the Oklahoma Panhandle. It'll have an intermediate converter station in the MISO market in Arkansas, and then about 3,500 megawatts will be delivered into TVA, where it can serve TVA and also go to other customers throughout the Mid-South and Southeast. There we go. So I want to talk a little bit about the supply side and then the demand side, and then sort of what we see is how we're getting it there, and then what we think the benefits are. So, if you're in the Oklahoma Panhandle, the wind blows pretty steadily. We're talking about above 50. We think that in general, 55% capacity factor is going to be the production that we're going to see. When we started the company 7 years ago, the wind turbines that were out there were at about 45%. We saw where the technology was going, and while that technology has certainly improved development in lower wind speed areas, and that's what a lot of times there's a lot of attention to how the taller turbines, larger rotors give you the ability to develop in lower wind speed areas. It's still a lot cheaper to be in the higher wind speed areas, and you get 40% more energy for roughly equivalent investment, or even a cheaper investment, as Steph showed, in Oklahoma than you would in other parts of the country. So on the demand side, what's driving all of this? You guys have probably heard a lot about this, but probably 4 big things. Obviously we've got a big transition going on. The retirement of coal, especially in the Southeast, is a very big deal. Demand hasn't been the traditional driver in the electric utility industry that's historically been, but this transition away from coal, is obviously really important. The natural gas generation side of it has been hugely important, but renewables is also going to be a big part of it. And our view is that it's really going to be both natural gas generation and renewable energy, both solar and wind, that's going to be the largest movers in the portfolio as we're moving forward. On the demand side also, you can't underestimate that customers are quite important. People are very favorable to more renewable clean energy. They don't want to pay a lot for it, and so that's where economic competition and being really efficient goes into it. But already the utilities in the Southeast and Mid-South have been buying wind. Southern Company's utilities are buying hundreds of megawatts already, and other utilities have. TVA has probably 8 or 9 wind PPAs, and they're using the existing transmission system to move that energy across 1 or 2 different RTOs, and what they've been finding is that congestion is a really serious issue, and actually being able to get it into their markets reliably and at a reliable cost can be a challenge, mostly because we didn't create this electric transmission system to do what we're trying to do, which is move huge amounts of energy, across electrical regions. And then finally, moving forward, we do think that things like, carbon, even though the Southeast doesn't have renewable energy portfolio standards, it's very much based on economic competition. Those sorts of goals, and obviously the national context, they do make a difference. Probably less so in the Southeast than they do in other markets, but I think that the policy framework in general, we do think is pretty important. So we really have focused on direct current transmission technology to do this. And the reason we did this is because it's the cheapest way to move a lot of power a long way. DC technology has been used very extensively for very large hydroelectric projects in northern Canada, going down to their population centers. In the US, there's probably 5 or 6 long-distance HVDC projects that were done in the 70s and 80s. The most important one is the Pacific Intertie on the west coast that moves hydropower from the Bonneville power complex on the Oregon-Washington border down to Los Angeles. It was first started in the early 60s, completed in the early 70s, has gone through 2 or 3 upgrades, and is still providing power and stability between these 2 different regions. So the advantage of DC is you can move a lot of power over a single set of poles. That's good from a land use perspective. It also helps in terms of cost. Once you're talking about anything over about 400 miles, if you're really going over point-to-point DC, direct current technology is very competitive economically. Then in terms of our business model, it kind of fits. Because we're doing interregional projects, we don't really have a preset cost allocation policy framework that we can work within. If we were doing the project from one end of MISO to the other, we'd work with MISO and work with their planning system and then figure out how we're going to get our revenue requirements from their overall tariff. You can't do that if you're across regions because we don't really have cost allocation interregionally in the United States. So we're doing this much more like a natural gas pipeline. We're looking at where the source is, we're looking at the generation, or where, in the case of gas, would be the producers. We're looking at the market, and then we're negotiating directly with clients, those generators primarily, and they're going to buy transmission capacity on our line. So what does this mean in terms of results? Just a couple of examples. If you do the market simulations using ProMod or other models, because the energy is pretty cheap, because we're getting it there pretty cheap, we're talking about significant reductions in terms of production cost savings across the Southeast and Mid-South. And then, on the environmental side, we have about 13 million tons of carbon dioxide reduced in this model, and others. It kind of depends on what you look at in terms of the starting generation mix in the Southeast between gas and coal. But if there's more coal on the margin, then obviously we're going to have a bigger carbon reduction. But in any case, it's still pretty significant. And then another way to look at value, just as an example, to give you one of the utilities that we think is a potential client and somebody we've been working with for a long time. And this is more of an avoided cost, sort of traditional utility avoided cost calculation. The first bar is really just sort of the avoided production cost, which is really just fuel savings. What does that look like in terms of importing the wind versus just generating from their traditional sources? There's also capacity value to wind. I wanted to point that out because I know in a lot of discussions, people talk about wind as an energy-only product. When you have 55% capacity factor wind, it provides a lot of capacity value. And even under like a really conservative scenario, we think if you have 1,000 megawatts of wind going into a place like TVA, it's about 150 megawatts of capacity value equivalent. So that is there. The avoided carbon emissions, depending on how you value that, depending on how all that works out, gives you a range of value as well. And then in the case of TVA, because TVA is interconnected to all the other major utilities in the Southeast and Mid-South, we would be able to wheel power, our clients would be able to wheel power to other utilities. They'd pay TVA that wheeling rate, and that would go directly to lower their costs. TVA is kind of a unique animal. They're a federal government utility. They can't actually, they don't actually make a profit, but one of the only places that they can actually collect revenues and use to lower their costs is on wheeling revenues, so it's kind of an interesting case. So, we're building this power infrastructure and this transmission line based on wind, and that really is, what we think it's going to address. But, overall, our utilization rate is going to be about 60%, which is, pretty, it's pretty much in line with DC interconnections throughout the world. They tend to run between 50 and 60%. So this is not like an underutilized transmission line by market standards. But, there's still other opportunities for value. And I just wanted to use this example. You know, if you, the other 40% of the time, you know, there still will be a potential there. One of the things that we think is going to be really interesting is mixing solar and wind. It turns out that some of the best solar regions in the eastern interconnection are actually in the Oklahoma Panhandle. You know, they're producing significantly more energy than you would with solar sites in the southeast. And then there's also the difference because of the curvature of the earth and the time differences. You actually get more energy when it's peak time, when people are starting to get home from work in Atlanta. You're at the best energetic time in terms of solar in the Panhandle. So that's one thing, and then just sort of more traditional arbitrage between different markets. You've got the Southeast, you know, with certain market drivers, Southwest Power Pool, SPP at another end, MISO is there as well. And depending on how those things work, there's going to be plenty of chance for, in the secondary market, for people to be able to move power and really optimize the use of the line and lower overall costs. So what I spend most of my time doing is not talking to economists, but talking to policy leaders, spending a lot of time locally. And what most people care about is, you know, how cheap is the energy and what does this mean to economic development? What does it mean to jobs? So we spent quite a bit of time talking about that. And I like to say that any good energy project is also a really great economic development project. And so, you know, we've got a $2 billion plus investment in our transmission line, about $7 billion of new wind generation. That's a lot of construction jobs. It's also a lot of economic activity in all of the states that the project's located in. It's a lot of manufacturing that's being driven largely in the US, and then it's in the states that we're going to be located, and then it's tax revenues and other revenues for folks that host the transmission line, that get royalties from the wind farms, and it adds up to a pretty big impact. And then finally, just to give you an idea of what it is that we're engaged in here. You know, this project we started working on in 2009. We are planning to start construction towards the end of 2017. You know, there's quite a bit to do, but we've done quite a bit on the project already. And when we're done, this will be one of the largest, basically, power complexes or power plants, in quotes, in the US of any kind. And it'll be the largest renewable energy project in the US by far. So that's encouraging and frightening for somebody who has some responsibility for getting that done, but it's an exciting time, I think, for renewable energy. And you know, a large part of what's driving this is really the cost that Steph was talking about. We think that that's continuing, and it's really driving a lot of activity.
Probably a good idea, because I would knock it over.
That's what kind of thing I would do.
That is not good.
Check the bottom.
Well, I sent the PDF version. Am I saying it the right way?
It's not one of those points at the top.
I don't believe so. That's not me. That's you.
Yes.
Like a good planning engineer, I always come prepared. I'm an N-1 contingency operator. But yeah, now we're in a -2 situation.
You have it on there already? Yeah. You open the folder.
Do you see? Oh, well, that's not good.
You can get
All right. All right.
My name is JT Smith. I work for MISO. I'm based out of our New Orleans, Louisiana office. I used to work in the Minnesota office for a number of years, but I'm originally from the Gulf Coast. So first opportunity I had the chance to get back to the South in warm weather, I took it as quick as I could. And the only reason why I was able to do that is because MISO covers a fairly extensive part of the middle portion of the country. We like to say we generally go from a reliability footprint perspective from the Hudson Bay to the Gulf of Mexico. When you add in our Canadian province coordinating member. But significant footprint and length, and I thought it was interesting listening to the Clean Line conversation because a lot of the value that's discussed there has a lot to do with diversity of the footprint. And it's one of the things that we've noticed quite a bit, especially when it comes to capacity, when it comes to energy delivery. Diversity of the footprint means a lot. When you have wind blowing in the west or solar in the west and peaking load conditions in the east, especially on these industrial corridors in the MISO footprint in Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan, you get to see a lot of value, but a big key of that is being able to deliver it to those systems. And when MISO is looking at integration of renewable resources in general, wind has been our biggest component. I think this past week, our first utility scale in front of the meter solar project actually just went active. 100 megawatts, that's it that MISO has in this footprint. But from a wind perspective, we're around the 16,000 megawatt mark. But it causes issues for us because when we first ramped up the market, the reliability coordination, we didn't have any of the intermittent resources. And as it was starting to ramp up, it was outpacing transmission build. It was causing issues for congestion management within our markets. And we just found that our tools just were not sufficient enough to help manage the intermittency and variability of those resources. And as we go forward, we're expecting more. MISO's footprint has state mandated RPS is equivalent to about 25 gigawatts of wind capacity that's going to show up. And I believe that's going to be the bottom of the penetration of renewable resources. We're adding about 1,000 megawatts a year right now on average. So we expect to continue to see this growth, and it's going to be a big part of our footprint in general. And our goal is to make sure that we can reliably operate around those resources and provide good market signals to make sure that we're getting the right participation from such resources. So the rapid development of wind was pretty significant for us from a traditional ultra-conservative utility planning perspective. It was a significant change. It was a paradigm shifting for how we operate in markets, how we manage reliability, how we look at the efficiencies of the various tools that we had available to us. And one of the big components of that was making sure that we tried to get ahead of the development. Now, unfortunately, we started way behind in renewable resource development, but our goal is to try to make sure that going forward, that we're meeting the needs as appropriate, not just from a planning perspective, but also making sure that we can reliably operate and take advantage of the resource as it's made available to us. So we took two paths associated. One was a planning path, building new infrastructure from a transmission perspective. As Mario mentioned earlier, you know, the wind resources in the country came from areas with very little transmission. And MISO recognized that significantly. MISO also had to fight the barrier of the Mississippi River. There's not a whole lot of transfer capability in our footprint that crossed the Mississippi River. So we developed what we called our multi-value project portfolio. $6.5 billion worth of transmission that essentially serves two purposes. One, to try to help interconnect in the local areas where the wind was below significantly, where we were seeing our development, primarily Iowa, Minnesota, North and South Dakota, and then close some of those gaps of high voltage transmission for energy transfer across the system to deliver it from the resources to the loads. Now, Mario mentioned that there's generally a cutoff of value when it comes to transmission, that if you are over that 400 or 500 mile distance of transfer, DC does become a viable option, and DC was one of the considerations we had in this situation. But what we were ended up looking at was we were delivering a much shorter path. So our goal on this was to close some of those transmission gaps on the EHV system from an AC perspective, but not eliminating the options for long-term high voltage DC, AC type scenarios that could, as we continue to grow our resources out, allow new plans to come in to deliver those remote resources to the load centers that would like to use them. So out of that $6.5 billion, one of the things that I think is interesting to look at this, wind resources can get into the generation interconnection queues, get approved, develop and build fairly quickly. This set of projects was approved in 2011 after 2 years of extensive study work with our membership. And their full in-service date won't be until 2019, 2020. So that causes a lot of issues because now you have a lot of resources that are coming in a little bit quicker, that are making those decisions come online, and they're being curtailed because the transmission system just can't keep up with them fast enough to get there. This is supposed to get us through 2025, maybe a little bit beyond that, but we've got to get there first. And right now, the wind resources are definitely outpacing us in that regard. So it's important to recognize that when we're doing these types of integrations and trying to bring these resources into the markets, transmission is not an easy path. Unfortunately, we're not all like Texas, or maybe fortunately we are all not like Texas, but Texas had a one-state regulatory process in which they were building out their CREZ lines to meet their wind needs. We have 15 states in MISO that we have to manage and go through public policy regulatory approvals, and that causes time to take as part of, even though the plans are good and the plans are probably, hopefully the right plans, you still got to go through the regulatory processes. And that's what generally becomes an issue when you're building out transmission to help integrate these types of resources. The other path we took at MISO was to move wind out of the nebulous of out-of-market decision-making and bring it into the market, bring them part of the optimization algorithm, so that wind was no longer being curtailed because it was out of market optimization and being left off so that we could manage what we could in the market. It was bringing them in so that they could help manage congestion on the transmission system. And until we get those MVPs up, there's a lot of management that we have to make. But it allows them to ramp down. They can't necessarily ramp up if the wind's not blowing, but it gives us an opportunity to let them play as part of the markets. Their maximum limits are generally determined by real-time constraints of resource generation, but they're allowed to now set market prices. They're allowed to participate in rapid forward commitment and day ahead in real-time market practices. They can self-schedule as they wish, but it's part of the equation that I can now, every 5 minutes, dispatch a wind unit with the rest of my dispatchable fleet to manage the congestion on my system. So when I do dispatch a unit down in a 5-minute window, I potentially could dispatch that unit back up the next 5-minute window, where before I may leave them off for 4 hours before I get back to them to be able to bring them back up if available. So we're actually allowing them to operate more in this situation where they are part of the optimization algorithm. So the two paths were very important in doing that. Infrastructure, and then the right market tools to handle bringing these resources into the conversation and not just treating them as out-of-market intermittent capacity or energy. The next thing MISO looked at specifically was, now that they're in the market, obviously when you have load ramping up during the day and wind ramping down at night, we were actually seeing price spikes in our energy markets that weren't necessarily related to reliability, they were related to scarcity due to ramp. So we're continuing to work on adding products to our tool set to make sure that prices are reflective of what's actually going on out there, and making sure that resources that do drive some counter interactions with the rest of the system, to make sure that we're not getting ridiculous type of market signals and that they actually match what is happening out there. So ramp products, bringing the dispatchable intermittent resources into their intermittent resources into a dispatchable nature, are market ways that we've been working on to bring these resources into operation to coincide with the reliability of the system. And then lastly here, we're not done. MISO's been looking significantly at decarbonization across the footprint. The Midwest part of our footprint is a historical coal burning footprint. I think in maybe 2010, 2011, the Midwest portion of MISO had about 80% of its energy was generated from coal-fired facilities. As we've expanded, brought energy into our system from the Southeast, they were primarily gas, so it helped bring down that coal contribution as a whole, but we really haven't seen a whole lot of reduction outside of external drivers like the mercury and air toxic standard, the cross-state pollution, cross-state air pollution rule, and potentially a CPP or a CPP-like program that's going to continue to drive us away from the traditional baseload resources and provide better opportunities and more incentives for the non-traditional new technology type resources, whether it's wind, solar, distributed, central site. It's going to change. And as a regional reliability coordinator, as operator of the transmission systems, our footprint, it's important that one, we make sure the infrastructure is staying solid. Doesn't happen overnight, but making sure that we're staying forward on that evaluation. And then second, making sure that we have the right market tools available so that these types of resources can participate and not drive problems, but help solve the problems within the markets. So that's all I had from the RTO regional perspective. It's a problem that we're addressing. It's something that when I first started talking about wind was scary, but it's less scary these days. I mean, we understand what is happening out there. We understand that there are capabilities and technologies, a lot of studies that you can look at and say, we've got a lot of room to grow in renewables. A lot of it's going to be infrastructure driven, whether it's HVDC, whether it's local AC that helps get us to those right positions, or whether it's, making sure that we have better coordination between our markets. As Mario mentioned also the SPP to MISO to TVA. There are a lot of seams issues that continue to be addressed that we have to continue to address to make sure that we are incentivizing the right type of infrastructure, the right type of interaction between our members and our neighbors so that we are getting the right information and the right resources out there for us all. So from that, I will now turn it over to Mr. Vogt.
First step is trying to negotiate the computer. It's not here. No, that line is loaded in. Where's that in this guy? Yeah, it's fine. All right, good morning, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you all today. I'm from ComEd, not Con Ed. We have an extra hump. It differentiates us. We've already seen a couple of good maps today, and when you looked at Jameson's map on MISO, there's a big hole right around Lake Michigan. That's the hole. We are actually part of PJM as opposed to MISO, so there's a transmission line that goes across the top of the state of Indiana that connects us into Ohio and First Energy with the rest of our sister utilities that are in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. As part of a disclaimer, I have to say, ComEd is owned by the largest nuclear operator in the country, Exelon. I will give you the perspective of the utility, but it's always a little interesting inside the company when you're the utility working with a large generator and how those policy issues often connect and conflict to a large degree. We have 5,000 transmission circuit miles over that service territory. A lot of the transmission lines that were shown on prior maps are ours. And I want to keep you focused over onto that far left over there by the Mississippi River, which Jameson talked about. That's going to be a focal point of what I'm going to talk about here in a few minutes. We are a summer peaking utility of about 21,000 megawatts is what we just hit this last summer, which is significantly down from where we were. Energy efficiency as well as renewables, we really drop in demand from a utility perspective. We're seeing very, very low load growth, and don't expect to pass 2007 levels of distribution until sometime around 2030. And I think by 2030 we'll probably be telling you that it's 2040 or 2050. Continues to push out the curve. We are a restructured state in Illinois. That means our customers have choice. They can buy power from any alternative supplier. ComEd is the default supplier for power for our residential customers. We are also the default supplier for our commercial and industrial customers. The chart shows you the breakdown. Right now, 57% of our residential load is served by others. 85% of our commercial and industrial load is served by others. For 75% of our total load is served by others. I'm the Vice President of Energy Acquisition, I don't have to acquire all that much. We only serve 24%, but we do settle the wholesale market as well. So we have to keep track of who those customers are buying power from, and we interact with the generators in terms of settling that market, making sure that we know who supplied what was the price paid for that power, and conveying that information to PJM on a day-to-day basis. We have a significant amount of nuclear resources in the state of Illinois. You can see coal and natural gas at about 17,000, wind at around 3,800 megawatts. Very little utility scale solar, 33 megawatts, and even less rooftop. We are a service territory with 3.8 million customers. I have 700 net metering customers in our service territory. So very little rooftop penetration. We expect that to change, but it'll all depend on what we do with RPS policy going forward. So as we talk about renewables and what our challenge is, we have an awful lot of nuclear generation in the service territory. We have a state RPS mandate to get to 25% renewables by 2025-26. We're on a PJM planning year, which is why it gets split. And you can see how those numbers ramp up over time. We have a cost cap in place, meaning we can only pay $1.89 per megawatt hour per customer in terms of what we can pay to acquire renewable power. That translates to a total average REC price of, by the time we get to 2025, we can't pay more than $10 per renewable REC, or we're going to run out of money. So one of the big challenges that we've seen is how do you maximize the amount of renewable power while minimizing the cost on customers? And the way to do that is to buy RECs out of state. You don't necessarily have to buy the energy. All you need is renewable energy credit, the attribute for renewable power, and you can qualify that for the RPS mandate. There's a lot of solar RECs out of state, whether it's in Arizona, California, Nevada, where there's a lot more solar, and there's a lot more wind RECs out of state than are in Illinois. The difference from that, obviously, is what you see up there is that in Illinois, a DG REC goes for $189 per REC versus a market price of around $24. So we can buy a lot more solar RECs if we go out of state than if we want to buy them in state. The developers, the renewable energy developers in the state of Illinois would really like to see that development happen in Illinois, as well as a lot of policy, legislator, other stakeholders would like to see that development happen in Illinois, which we can do, but we're going to pay more for those RECs and reduce the actual number of renewable energy RECs that we acquire, unless we're willing to put a bigger burden on the customers that we're ultimately supplying. If we choose to develop renewable resources inside of Illinois, then we start to put pressure on the nuclear plants that are already there. And the chart's what I'm showing up over to the left. This is July 2016. This is the ComEd zone pricing that we saw in the month of July. What's really interesting, I already said that we are a summer peaking utility. It's fascinating to me right now, but our highest price months are January and February. And it's really because of the polar vortex that occurred 2 years ago, where the gas plants have created an awful lot of uncertainty about whether they're going to be there in the winter. So we will see a higher price in the winter than we do in the summer, even though we're a summer peaking utility. So it's more of a supply side economic effect than it is a demand side economic effect right now. And traditionally, month-to-month pricing from a utility perspective has been demand side driven. What's happening to load, what's happening to weather that drives those prices. If you look at that top chart for the ComEd zone, the overall average in the month of July is $28.50. The top price in that month was $132, and we had 5 hours in that month that were below zero. that's what happens when you dump a lot of wind. And one of the charts that I think was great was it showed capacity factors by the wind, right? The capacity factors from the wind are highest in those non-peak hours. They dip a little bit in those peak hours. So there's a lot of load coming onto the system in those non-peak hours. And the problem with nuclear plants is you can't cycle them up and cycle them down. They're base load and running. So they're gonna run. That bottom chart shows what's happening in Quad City. So I talked about that little part of the far west portion of our service territory over by the Mississippi River, where all that wind from Iowa in the middle of the country, in the chart that Mario is showing, is where it's all located. That's where it's all dumping because we're the market. Chicago is kind of like back into the 1800s when all the cattle was driven to Chicago for the slaughterhouses, and it was going to be slaughtered and then shipped east and locally. It's sort of the same thing with wind. So for Quad Cities, you can see that red line on the lows, and that we had 32 hours that were below zero with a maximum negative amount of $59. There's a negative 59. Means you could get paid $59 not to run. Unfortunately, we can't do that with the nukes. So what's starting to happen is sort of this unintended consequences for renewables. I think the expectation was, right, when the renewables come in, they're going to knock off that top stack. They're going to knock off the peakers and the coal out of the stack first. And what's really happening is because of the characteristics of when that wind appears at the time of day and what it's competing with, it's starting to knock the nuclear out. So we've announced a shutdown for Quad Cities. We're going to take that plant out of service, absent any legislative action within this state of Illinois, which is what I do on my non-day job. But absent something like what we've proposed in New York, which is a zero emission credit, because the nuclear plants also have zero emissions as opposed just like wind and solar, those plants are going to shut down. When we take those plants out of the mix, the overall price for the customer is going to go up, at least on the short term. I mean, a lot of economists in the room would be really helpful to understand what short term and long term is, because we get into this debate all the time. But at least in this room, you'll agree that the prices actually change at some point. A lot of policy holders don't even agree to that'll even happen. But when we take the nuclear plants out of this stack, we're most likely in the short term going to replace it with coal and gas, which is going to have a counter effect on the renewable portfolio standard. It's also going to increase costs to the customers. So our biggest challenge really is trying to understand that customers' choices and desires are changing from where they've been in the past, that they want more choice on control, they want more choice on generation mix, even if they want to self-generate. So we're trying to understand how to give them those choices, meet the state and federal clean power mandates, but at the same time manage the cost on the customers. Because we know, oddly enough, it's our bill. Even for customers who are buying power from an alternative supplier, we're the one billing it for those suppliers. So the backlash comes on to the customer-facing entity, which is us. So as the cost goes up, we feel the backlash regardless of what policy was actually driving potential cost changes. So those are our challenges, and thank you for the opportunity to talk.
All right, well, let's, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. Let me follow up directly with Scott, since he's freshest on my mind, about the issue of developing renewables in Illinois versus outside. I understand that the economics dictate something. What is the political? I mean, you mentioned developers wanting you to promote or make it possible for them to work in the state, but I'm a little bit more curious about what the politicians and ratepayers.
It's really interesting. there is a desire by the developers and by certain policyholders to say, or at least the thinking, that the renewable development will drive jobs in Illinois. But the conundrum or the paradox is it also drive out jobs out of Illinois, where a nuclear plant, Quad Cities, we have another one in Clinton, which is in the southern part of the state, also facing closure, but between those two plants, it's 4,000 jobs. Those are 4,000 jobs that have been there that are pretty well-paid jobs. And while you will get the construction jobs of the development from the wind and the solar, the question is how many people do you need to run those? So what is the net effect of jobs from pushing that through? And that's sort of that's the push-pull that's going on in Illinois right now. You know, there is a desire to have that development occur in Illinois for those jobs, but at the same time, maybe not as much of a recognition of what it's going to do to the jobs that are already there.
Thanks. I'm just kind of going back to high points or things that I notated about the talk. So Mario, I'm sort of curious about the slide you showed that gave wheeling some credit, some revenue credit in terms of the model. But what I don't recall is whether you said that was something specific to TVA or whether that is something that can be applied across the board in other utility companies.
Yeah, I mean, in that case, it really is looking specifically at TVA because they own the 500 kV system, you know, in Tennessee plus 6 other states. And so to get from TVA, from an interconnection point to TVA, we'd be east of Memphis. To get from there to Georgia Power, for example, or Duke Energy or PJM, you have to pay the wheeling rate to TVA, so that'd be a revenue impact to TVA. So, you know, the numbers that we showed assume 1,000 megawatts of purchase by TVA and then 2,500 megawatts going to other markets, basically across TVA's system.
All right, so it's not a magic bullet for doing business on the grid. It's just TVA specific. Right. Okay. JT, you talked a lot about taking power from various sector segments and regions, but I didn't hear you mention the term merit order, which is, for someone who's been covering the industry as long as I have, they used to be the holy grail. They used to be the Bible. And merit order had everything, and which is really just coded for cost. You know, take the cheap stuff first, then the slightly less cheap stuff second. You know, so even I can understand. Well, yeah, it doesn't get a lot of mention these days. Is that an intentional thing, or I guess another way to put a question is, how does merit order overlap with the acquisition chain, if you will, that you're following?
The market engines start with merit order with non-constrained systems. As soon as you start adding constraints, merit order goes out the window, essentially.
And tell us about, I mean, I think we all know some constraints, but give us examples of what you mean.
So when you think about wind, most of them are submitting minus 40 market offers, right? Because they're taking essentially what they could physically pay back to the system to continue to run, and it's generally based off of the production tax credits that they're getting. So they can run down to some of those negative numbers, and you can tell it impacts some of the other type of generators that are out there. But the system where they're building, in our footprint, northern Iowa, southern Minnesota, the Dakotas, the transmission system is not sufficient to push those out. So the merit order, they will dispatch base no matter what. If the system is unconstrained, they will, your merit order will actually look much like what we saw for the ComEd function. They'll be on the bottom and they'll start hitting those other units as they go out. Problem is once you start adding the transmission congestion to the system, you start running out